Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring Earthmen vs. the Aliens, Volume 2. Quiet Please by Kevin Scott. Come Into My Brain by Robert Silverberg. From Beyond the Stars by Murray Leinster. Restricted Tool by Malcolm B. Morehart, Jr. Tony and the Beetles by Philip K. Dick. Quiet Please by Kevin Scott. Originally published in Worlds of If, November 1961. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Groversb knew what he wanted. Peace and quiet. He was willing to scream his head off for it. The big man eased the piano off his back and stood looking at Groversb. You ain't gonna like it here. He mopped his face. Boy, will I ever be glad to get off this cockeyed planet. Groversb pushed at his spectacles, sniffed, and said, Quiet. The big man said, Ain't no native here with 3 feet tall, and they got some crazy kind of communication. They don't talk. Groversb said, Quiet. Huh? Precisely why I'm here. I, said Groversb, sniffing again, loathe conversation. Oh, well, he left. Alone, Groversb surveyed his realm. The house was the shell of what had formerly been a little people apartment building. Ceilings, floors and walls had been removed to form one large room. The tiny doors and windows had been sealed, and a single window and door had been cut into the shell for Groversb's use. Crude, but serviceable. Groversb walked to the window and looked down the slope. Little people buildings dotted the landscape, and the people themselves scurried silently about. Yes, thought Groversb, it would do nicely. He had brought an adequate food tablet supply. He would finish, without the distraction of voices, his beautiful concerto. He would return to Earth famous and happy. Armed with paper and pencils, he went to the piano, having decided to enlarge upon the theme in the second movement. His mind knew exactly how the passage should run, and he swiftly covered the paper with sharp, angular notes. Then he triumphantly lifted his hands and began to play what he had written. He jerked back from the keyboard, his hair on end, his teeth on edge, his ears screaming with the mass of sounds they had produced. He looked at his hands, peered at the score, adjusted his spectacles, and tried again. I'm tired, he thought, recoiling in horror from the racket. A food tablet and a nap will remedy the situation. When he awoke, Groversb walked to the window, refreshed. A violet glow had replaced the harsh yellow light of day. At the foot of the slope, the little people dashed to and fro, but no voice broke the peaceful quiet of the evening. With a sigh of satisfaction, Groversb went to the piano. Gently he struck the keys. Blatant, jumbled noise filled the room. Breathing hard, Groversb rose and gingerly lifted the spinet's lid. No, nothing amiss there. Good felts, free hammers, solid-sounding board. Must be out of tune. Groversb closed the lid, sat down, and struck a single note. A clear tone sang out. He moved chromatically up and down the scale. Definitely not out of tune. He shifted the score, glanced uneasily at the keys, and began to play. Discord immediately pierced his eardrums. He clapped his hands over his ears and leapt wildly from the piano bench. The trip, he decided frantically. It must have affected my hearing. He flung himself from the house and down the slope. The little people scattered, staring. He charged into the administration building and clutched the lapels of a uniformed official. "A doctor!" he gasped. "Now! This minute!" The official raised his eyebrows and removed Grover's hands with distaste. "It's a little late in the day," he drawled, "but maybe the doc on the top floor." Groversb flew up the stairs and into the doctor's office. The doctor's face lit up. "A patient!" he exclaimed. "Capital! What seems to be the trouble? Food poisoning? Shouldn't eat the food here. Garbage. Appendix? Heart attack?" "Stop talking, you idiot. It's my ears." Obviously disappointed, the doctor nevertheless poked and peered at Grover's ears. "No," he said finally. "A trifle big, yes, but nothing wrong with them." "You're sure?" "Absolutely. A pity. I'm getting a bit rusty." With a groan, Grover's staggered out of the building, back through town and up the slope to his house. Seating himself firmly on the bench, he began to play. He shuddered. The noise was abominable. Suddenly his door burst open and a crowd of little people rushed in. They pulled him off the bench and slapped angrily at his hands. Then, with cutters, they attacked the piano. "Here, stop that!" Grover screeched. "What do you think you're doing?" The little people pushed and dragged him out of the house, down the slope, through the town and into the launching bowl at the space strip. The launching agent took one look and yelled, "Get the interpreter! On the double!" The interpreter ran up and whipped something from his pocket. It looked like a miniature piano skeleton. He tripped a hammer. There was a faint tinkle. Instantly, one of the little people produced a single miniature hammer and tapped it rapidly against his skull. The interpreter tripped another hammer. A second little one responded. Suddenly, one of the little people ran over and tripped all the interpreter's hammers simultaneously. The little people winced. "Oh," said the interpreter. "Well, it's their planet." He hustled Grover out to a freight ship that was warming up for takeoff. "Is everyone insane?" Grover croaked. "I demand to know what this is all about." The interpreter shoved Grover into the ship. "They say you talk too much," he yelled as he slammed the door. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Come Into My Brain by Robert Silverberg, writing as Alexander Blade. Originally published in Imagination Stories of Science and Fantasy, June 1958. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Fitted with a new thought helmet, Dane Harold plunged into the venomous brain of the alien. It was a fast way to commit suicide. Dane Harold held the thought helmet tightly between his hands, and, before putting it on, glanced over at the bound, writhing alien sitting opposite him. The alien snarled defiantly. "You're sure you want to go through with this?" asked Dr. Phelps. Harold nodded. "I volunteered, didn't I? I said I'd take a look inside this buzzard's brain, and I'm going to do it. If I don't come up in half an hour, come get me." "Right." Harold slipped the cool bulk of the thought helmet over his head and signaled to the scientist, who pulled the actuator switch. Harold shuddered as psionic current surged through him. He stiffened, wriggled, and felt himself glide out of his body, hover incorporeally in the air between his now soulless shell and the alien bound opposite. "Remember, you volunteered," he told himself. He hung for a moment outside the alien's skull. Then he drifted downward and in. He had entered the alien's mind. Whether he would emerge alive, and with the troop deployment data, well, that was another matter entirely. The patrol ships of the Terran outpost on planetoid 113 had discovered the alien scout a week before. The Dymalian spy was lurking about the outermost reaches of the Terran safety zone when he was caught. It wasn't often that Earth captured a Damelian alive, and so the outpost resolved to comb as much information from him as possible. The Earth-Damel war was 4 years old. Neither side had scored a decisive victory. It was believed that Damel was massing its fleet for an all-out attack on Earth itself. Confirmation of this from the captured scout would make Terran defensive tactics considerably more sound. But the Damelian resisted all forms of brainwashing until Phelps, the base psych man, came forth with the experimental thought helmet. Volunteers were requested. Harold spoke up first. Now, wearing the thought helmet, he plunged deep into the unknown areas of the Damelian's mind, hoping to emerge with high-order military secrets. His first impression was of thick grey murk, so thick it could be cut. Using a swimming motion, Harold drifted downward toward the light in the distance. It was a long way down. He floated eerily in free fall. Finally, he touched the ground. It yielded under him spongily, but it was solid. He looked around. The place was alien. Coarse, crumbly red soil, giant spike-leaved trees that shot up hundreds of feet overhead, brutal-looking birds squawking and chattering in the low branches. It looked just like the tridim solidos of Damel he had seen. Well, why not? Why shouldn't the inside of a man's mind, or an alien's for that matter, resemble his home world? Cautiously, Harold started to walk. Mountains rose in the dim distance, and he could see, glittering on a mountaintop far beyond him, the white bulk of an armored castle. Of course, his imaginative mind realized at once that here was where the Damelian guarded his precious secrets. Up there, on the mountain, was his goal. He started to walk. Low-hanging vines obscured his way. He conjured up a machete and cut them down. The weapon felt firm and real in his hand, but he realized that not even the hand was real. All this was but an imaginative projection. The castle was further away than he had thought. He saw this after he had walked for perhaps 15 minutes. There was no telling duration inside the alien's skull either, or distance. The castle seemed just as distant now as when he had begun, and his 15-minute journey through the jungle had tired him. Suddenly, demonic laughter sounded up ahead in the jungle. Harsh, ugly laughter. And the Damelian appeared, slashing his way through the vines with swashbuckling abandon. "Get out of my mind, Earthman!" The Damelian was larger than life and twice as ugly. It was an idealized, self-glorified mental image Harold faced. The captured Damelian was about 5 feet tall, thick-shouldered, with sturdy corded arms and supplementary tentacles sprouting from its shoulders. Its skin was green and leathery, dotted with toad-like warts. Harold now saw a creature close to 9 feet tall, swaggering, with a mighty barrel of a chest and a huge broadsword clutched in one of its arms. The tentacles writhed purposefully. "You know why I'm here, alien. I want to know certain facts, and I'm not getting out of your mind until I've wrung them from you." The alien's lipless mouth curved in a bleak smile. "Big words, little Earthman. But first you'll have to vanquish me." And the Damelian stepped forward. Harold met the down-crashing blow of the alien's broadsword fully. The shock of impact sent numbing shivers up his arm as far as his shoulder, but he held on and turned aside the blow. It wasn't fair. The Damelian had a vaster reach than he could ever hope for. No. He saw there was no reason why he couldn't control the size of his own mental image. Instantly he was 10 feet high and advancing remorselessly toward the alien. Swords clashed clangorously. The forest birds screamed. Harold drove the alien back, and the Damelian was 11 feet high. "We can keep this up forever," Harold said, getting larger and larger. "This is only a mental conflict." He shot up until he again towered a foot above the alien's head. He swung downward two-handedly with a machete. The alien vanished. and reappeared 5 feet to the right. "Enough of this foolishness, Earthmen. Physical conflict will be endless stalemate since we're only mental projections. You're beaten. There's no possible way you can defeat me or I defeat you. Don't waste your time and mine. Get out of my mind." Harold shook his head doggedly. "I'm in here to do a job, and I'm not leaving until I've done it." He sprang forward, sword high, and thrust down at the grinning Damelian. Again the Damelian sidestepped. Harold's sword cut air. "Don't tire yourself out, Earthman," the alien said mockingly, and vanished. Harold stood alone in the heart of the steaming jungle, leaning on his sword. Maybe he was only a mental projection, he thought, but a mental projection could still get thoroughly drenched with its own mental sweat. The castle still gleamed enigmatically on the distant mountain. He couldn't get there by walking. At least it hadn't seemed to draw any nearer during his jaunt through the jungle. Hand-to-hand combat with the alien appeared fruitless. A fight in which both participants could change size at will, vanish, reappear, and do other such things was as pointless as a game of poker with every card wild. But there had to be a way. Mental attack? Perhaps that would crumble the alien's defenses? He sent out a beam of thought, directed up at the castle. "Can you hear me, alien?" Mental laughter echoed mockingly back. "Of course, Earthman. What troubles you?" Harold made no reply. He stood silently, concentrating, marshalling his powers. Then he hurled a bolt of mental energy with all his strength toward the mocking voice. The jungle shuddered as if struck home. The ground lurched wildly, like an animal's back. Trees tumbled, the sky bent. Harold saw he had scored a hit. The alien's concentration had wavered, distorting the scenery. But there was quick recovery. Again the mocking laughter. Harold knew that the alien had shrugged off the blow. And then the counter-blow. It caught Harold unawares and sent him spinning back a dozen feet, to land in a tangled heap beneath a dangling nest of vines. His head rocked, seemed ready to split apart. He sensed the alien readying a second offensive drive and set up counter-screens. This time he was ready. He diverted the attack easily and shook his head to clear it. The score was even, one stunning blow apiece, but he had recovered, and so had the alien. Harold aimed another blow and felt the alien sweep it aside. Back came the answering barrage of mental force. Harold blocked it. "Stalemate again," the alien said. "We're evenly matched," Harold replied, "but I'll beat you." He looked up at the far-off castle on the mountainside. "I'll beat you yet." "That remains to be proven, troublesome Earthman." Harold tramped on through the jungle of the alien's mind for a while, and then, realizing he was getting no closer to the all-important castle on the hill, stopped by a brook to wipe away his perspiration. It was hot on this accursed world, hot, muggy, dank. He kneeled over the water's surface. It looked pure, cool. A sudden thought struck him, and he ripped a strip from his shirt and dipped it in the water. The plastic cloth blackened and charred. He let it drop, and the water quickly finished the job. Pool? No. Concentrated sulfuric acid or something just as destructive. Smiling grimly at his narrow escape, he wiped his perspiration with another strip torn from his sleeve and kept going. Several hours at least had passed since he had entered the strange world within the alien's mind. That meant one of two things. Either the time scale in here was different from that outside, or his half-hour limit had elapsed in the outer world and Dr. Phelps had been unsuccessful in bringing him back. That was a nice thought. Suppose he was stuck here indefinitely, inside the mind of an alien being, in a muggy jungle full of sulfuric acid brooks. Well, he thought, I asked for it. The stalemate couldn't continue indefinitely. If he had swallowed some of the acid, that would have ended the contest without doubt. he wouldn't have had time to cope with the searing fluid. The answer lay there. Surprise. Both he and the alien were mental entities who could do battle as they pleased. But in this conflict, it was necessary to take the opponent by surprise before he could counterthrust or vanish. He began to see a solution. Up ahead lay the castle, unreachable through some trick of the aliens. Very well. Harold's brows drew together in concentration for a moment. His mind planned a strategy, and formed men to carry it out. There were 6 of him, suddenly. 6 identical Harolds, identical in size, shape, form, purpose. They would attack the Dimelian simultaneously, or at least 5 of them would, creating a diversionary action while the 6th, Harold Original, made a frontal assault on the castle. Harold Original faced his 5 duplicates and briefly instructed each in his job. They were like puppets. Harold 1, you are to attack in conjunction with Harold 2 on the mental level. Take turns heaving mental bolts at the alien. While one of you is recharging, the other is to unload. That won't give him time to get any sort of defense organized, and certainly no counterattack. Harold 3 and Harold 4, you are to attack physically, one armed with sword and one with blaster, from opposite sides at once. That ought to keep him busy while he's fighting off the rest of you. Harold 5, your job is to serve as front-runner, to find the Dimelian and engage him in conversation while the other 4 are getting ready to attack. Make him angry, get him concerned about what you're saying. The instant his defenses drop, the other 4 of you jump in. All of you got that? They nodded in unison. Good. Meanwhile, I'll make an assault on the castle, and maybe I can get through with you 5 running interference for me. He dismissed them, and they set out in different directions. He didn't want the Dimelian to find out what was up. If the alien saw the strategy and had time to create duplicates of its own, the conflict would end in stalemate again. Harold waited, while his 5 duplicates went into action. Through the mental link with Harold 5, he listened as his duplicate said, "The time has come to finish you off, alien. I'm glad I found you. That acid trick almost got me, but not quite." "A pity," the alien replied. "I was hoping the ruse would finish you. It's becoming quite irritating having you in here. You're starting to bore me." "Just you wait, you overstuffed warthog. I'll have those tentacles of yours clipped soon enough." "Empty words, Earthman. You run out of strategies. Your best course is to get out of my mind and forget this entire silly affair." "Oh no, I'll have those secrets pried out of you quicker than you think." "How?" "I'm not giving away my secrets, alien. I'm here after yours." Harold readied himself. He gave the signal. Now. Harold 1 and Harold 3 appeared. Harold 1 loosed a bombardment of mental force that shook the alien. Harold 3 dashed forward, wielding a machete. Harold 2 and Harold 4 went into action, Harold 2 following up with a second mental bolt, Harold 4 firing a blaster. The bedeviled alien looked from side to side, not knowing where to defend himself first. The scenery began to rock. The alien was going down. Harold took to the air. Levitating easily above the jungle, he found the castle and zeroed in on it. As he dropped downward, it changed, from a vaulting, proud collection of spires and battlements to a blocky square building, and from that into an armoured box with a padlock. The Dimelian stood before it, struggling with the 5 duplicate Harolds. Harold stepped past, through the writhing group. The Dimelian's defences were down. The secrets were unguarded. He wrenched the padlock off with a contemptuous twist of his hand. The box sprang open. Inside lay documents, neatly typed, ready for his eye. The alien uttered a mighty howl. The forest dissolved. The universe swirled around Harold's head. He woke. It seemed to be months later. Dr. Phelps stood by his side. Harold took 2 or 3 deep breaths, clearing his head. He grinned. "I've got them," he said. Information of troop movements, plan of battle, even the line of journey across space. "Good work," the psych man said. "I was worried at first. You had some expressions of real terror on your face when you put the helmet on." "Dead?" "I'm afraid so." Harold grinned weakly. "I guess I was just too many for him. The shock of having the core of his mind penetrated." Tiredly he said, "Doc, how come you didn't get me out at the half-hour mark?" "Eh?" "I told you to pull me out after half an hour had gone by. Why didn't you? I was in there half a day at least, and I might have stayed there forever." The psych man was looking at him strangely. "Half a day, you say? No, Lieutenant Harold. The total time elapsed from the moment you donned the helmet to the instant the alien screamed. Why, it was less than 10 seconds. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. From Beyond the Stars by Murray Leinster, writing as Will F. Jenkins. Originally published in Thrilling Wonder Stories, June 1947. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Tommy Driscoll laid on his stomach in the grass outside his father's laboratory and read his comic books. He was 10 years old, and wholly innocent of any idea that fate or chance or destiny might make use of him to make the comic books come true. He was clad in grubby shorts, with sandals and no socks or blouse. Ants crawled on his legs as he lay on the ground, and he absently scratched them off. To the adult eye, he was merely the son of that Professor Driscoll who taught advanced physics at Harwell College, and in summer vacation puttered around with research. As such, Tommy was inconsiderable from any standpoint except that of fate or chance or destiny. They had use for him. He was, however, wholly and triumphantly a normal small boy. As he scratched thoughtfully and absorbed the pictures in his comic book, he was Space Captain McGee of the rocket cruiser Omadoom, gloriously defeating, for the 15th time since he had acquired the book, the dastardly scheme of the dictator of Pluto to enslave the human race to the green-skinned, stalk-eyed denizens of that dark planet. A little while since, he had been the Star Rover, crimson-cloaked and crimson-masked, and mysteriously endowed with the power to survive unharmed the frigidity and airlessness of interstellar space. As the Star Rover, he had triumphantly smashed the attempt of some very unpleasant Mercurians to wipe out the human race so that they could emigrate to Earth. As both splendid figures, at satisfyingly frequent intervals, Tommy had swung mighty blows at the jaws or midriffs of Mercurians, green-skinned Plutonians, renegade Earthmen, and others. But he had just finished reading both comics 3 times in succession. He heaved a sigh of comfortable mental repletion and rolled over, imagining further splendid if formless adventures with spaceships and ray guns. Locusts whirred monotonously in the maple trees of Harwell College campus. His father's laboratory was a small stone structure off the physics building, and Tommy waited for his father and Professor Wardle to come out. When they did, he would walk home with them and possibly acquire an ice cream cone on the way. With luck, he might wangle another comic. He heard his father's voice, talking to Professor Wardle, who was spending the weekend with them. "There's the setup," said his father inside the laboratory. "Absurd, perhaps, but this Jansky radiation bothers me. I found out one rather startling thing about it." "My dear fellow," Professor Wardle said dryly, "if you publish anything about the Jansky radiation, the newspaper will accuse you of communicating with Mars." Tommy knew by his father's tone that he was grinning. "I've not thought of anything so conservative. Everybody knows that the Jansky radiation comes from the direction of the Milky Way and from beyond the solar system. It makes a hissing noise in a sensitive shortwave receiver. No modulation has ever been detected, but no explanation has been offered either." Professor Wardle moved inside the laboratory.
"What's the startling fact you've discovered?" he asked. "It's got a point source," Tommy Driscoll's father said, and Tommy could tell he was still grinning. "It comes from one spot. There's a second-order effect in our atmosphere which has masked it up to now. I can prove it." Tommy chewed on a grass stem. As the son of a professor of physics, he was disillusioned about scientists. They were not like the scientists of the comic books, who were mostly mad geniuses with plans to make themselves emperors of Earth and had to be foiled by Captain McGee or the Star Rover. Tommy knew pessimistically that scientists just took long words, like his father now, but Professor Wardle seemed startled. "A point source? But confound it, man, that would mean it's artificial, not natural, that it was a signal from beyond the stars. What else could it mean?" "I'd like to know myself," said Tommy's father ruefully. "I've checked for interruptions like dots and dashes, and for modulations like our radio. I've made sure it isn't frequency modulated. The only thing left is television." "Therefore the television screen," said Professor Wardle. "I see. You're trying to analyze it with a scanning system." Possible. But if it is a signal from another solar system—" Tommy Driscoll sat up straight, his eyes wide and astonished. His mouth formed itself into a particularly round O. This, of course, was a natural occurrence if fate or chance or destiny was to use him to make the comic books come true. He had been listening with only a fraction of his ears. To a 10-year-old boy, adults do not often seem intelligent. Few of them have any interest in Space Captain McGee or the Star Rover. But Tommy's father was talking about interplanetary communication, of signals from the planets of another sun, from creatures who might be super-intelligent vegetables like the Wangos or the Star Rover had to fight, or immaterial entities like those misty things that almost defeated Captain McGee on the Ghost Planet, because when he swung his mighty fist there wasn't anything solid for him to hit. Tommy's father was talking about things like that. He got up and gazed in the open door of the small laboratory. He regarded the rather messy assemblage of equipment on the workbench with bright-eyed, respectful awe. His father nodded. "Hello, Captain," he said to his son. "No hot wires around? Come in. What's on your mind?" Tommy's eyes shone. You were talking about signals from another planet." "I see," said his father. "Right up your alley, eh? I hadn't realized the popular appeal, but if you'd like to listen—" Tommy fairly quivered with eagerness. His father threw a switch. There was a tiny hum from a loudspeaker, then silence. Then, presently, there was a tiny hissing noise. Just a hissing sound. Nothing else. "That's it, Captain," his father told Tommy. "That's the noise the Jansky radiation makes. When we turn this dial, we tune it out this way," he demonstrated. "And also when we turn the dial that way. Then we tune it back in." He proved it. Nobody has ever explained it, but it comes from outer space. I think it comes from just one spot. Professor Wardle, smoking a pipe and sprawled in a chair, nodded amiably at Tommy. "Yes, sir," Tommy said, thrilled. His throat went dry from excitement. His father threw a second switch. A television screen glowed faintly. "Now it's transferred to the screen," he told Tommy. "But it's still all scrambled. Nothing happens. It's quite a job to unscramble a television signal, even when you know all about the transmitter. If there's a transmitter sending this, I don't know any of its constants." Over Tommy's head, he said to Professor Wardle, "The possible combinations run 10 to the 9th. Professor Wardle nodded. "Lines per inch, size of screen, images per second, possible colours," he grunted. "Then the scanning pattern and possible 3 dimensions and so on. You've got several billion possible variations, all right." "Unscramble it, Dad," said Tommy eagerly. "Please, I want to see what the people look like who's sending it. Do you think we can lick them if they get tough?" "I'm telling you," his father explained, "that I can try several billion ways to unscramble this supposed signal. Even if it can be done, only one of them will be right. It's going to take time." "But, Dad, please try." Tommy was filled with infinite excitement. which of course was not only necessary if the comic books were to be made to come true, but was wholly normal, small boy. Here was an interstellar signal. He had heard it. Tune the set right, and he would see. Maybe something like the giraffe men who almost killed Captain McGee on the planet of sand, or the frogmen the Star Rover had to fight when a crippled spaceliner was forced to descend on the watery planet Arlith. "I've got to figure out a way to unscramble it, Tommy," his father said. "I've got to calculate the settings that are most likely to show some change on the screen. It's rather like breaking a code. It will take a couple of weeks to compute a series of settings to try, one after the other." Tommy was unconvinced. He argued. Space Captain McGee's friend Doc Blandy would simply have whipped out his trusty slide rule and made the computations in seconds. He would push the slide back and forth, set the television controls according to his computations, and say, "On the beam, McGee." And Space Captain McGee would gaze into the television screen and see the worm monsters of Blathock about to chloroform Jenny, Captain McGee's girlfriend, to transfer the brain of a worm monster into her skull. Her body would thereafter house an inveterate enemy to the human race, with specific plans for annihilating it. Tommy argued. Impassionately, in the end his father had to resort to authority to stop his arguing. And then Tommy was tempted to revert to his former disillusionment about scientists. But continued belief offered high reward in excitement, so he believed. Still, it was a rebellious small boy who accompanied his father and Professor Wardle home. Even the expected ice cream cone did not console him. He consumed it in an avid gloom. His father tried to comfort him. "After all, we're not sure," he told Tommy. "It might not be a signal at all, or it might be a signal of a type that would seem simple enough to the creatures who sent it, but hopelessly complicated to us. They might be so much farther advanced in science. In any case, it's not a thing to be solved offhand." "But you're going to try, aren't you, Dad?" asked Tommy desperately. "You said it wouldn't do any harm. You said we could lick them. They couldn't harm Earth." "I'll try," his father assured him. "It's simply useless to go it blind. That's all. I'll have my calculations done in a couple of weeks, and you can watch while I try the whole business. All right?" Tommy gulped. He was unable to speak for disappointment. When one is 10 years old, odds of billions to one are negligible. But 2 weeks of waiting is eternity. It is exactly the same as never. And this, too, was not only in the necessary pattern of things in the comic books were to come true, but it was perfectly natural, small boy. That night, Tommy went rebellious to bed the third time he was told. He had hung around his father and Professor Wardle, listening hungrily to every incomprehensible word they said. He was keyed up to enormous excitement. He slept only fitfully. The comics had been a make-believe world in which he believed only with a book in his hand. Now they promised to become real, and he was filled with a monstrous hunger for the adventure they promised. He woke at dawn, and his lurid, fitful dreams had made him ripe for desperate and daring deeds. He slipped into his shorts and sandals and went downstairs. He gulped a huge glass of milk and stuffed down an ample slice of cake. Then he came to a grand and desperate resolution. He slipped out the back door and trudged across the dew-wet campus to his father's laboratory. He wormed unseen into the small building. His heart beat fast. He was scared, but he was Space Captain McGee and the Star Rover all rolled into one, in his own mind, and definitely he was 10-year-old Tommy Driscoll. He remembered, of course, how his father had turned on the shortwave set and the television screen. No small boy could forget those items. He sat down before the controls and threw the 2 switches with a grandly negligent gesture that Captain McGee himself could not have bettered, and then he started, blindly but with infinite confidence, to unscramble the Jansky radiation. He was only one half making believe, and one half deadly earnest, and all absolute faith. Naturally, the odds against any one setting of the controls being the right one to unscramble the Jansky radiation were several billion to 1. But the heroes of comic books always win against odds like that. So did Tommy Driscoll. The comic books were fated to come true. The faintly glowing television screen quite impossibly flickered as he turned the controls. His heart pounded. He worked on, his eyes shining and his head far above the clouds out in interstellar space with Captain McGee and the Star Rover. Presently, quite impossibly, the screen became a steadily pulsating rectangle which at its brightest was very bright indeed. He found a maximum brightness on which he could not improve. He worked other controls at random. One made odd streaks appear on the screen. At the peak of streakiness, Tommy's heart was thumping in his throat. He, Tommy Driscoll, was about to make contact with the people of another planet, circling another distant sun. Another knob suddenly gathered together the shriekings and the pulsations. They made the vaguest of patterns, and then the fuzziest of images. His hand shaking uncontrollably, Tommy Driscoll continued to turn that knob with the slowest possible movements. He had a flash of clearness, and his heart leaped. Then everything was fuzzy again. He turned the knob back, his breath coming in excited pantings. And then, in total defiance of the laws of chance, but in strict obedience to fate and destiny, there was abruptly a perfectly clear picture on the screen. It was not a picture of any place on earth, but of somewhere else, a place so alien in every respect that Tommy would never be able to describe it. And there was a thing looking out of the screen at Tommy Driscoll. His heart did multiple flip-flops, and he shook all over. But it shocked him much less than it would have shocked an adult, because he was wholly familiar with such apparitions from the comic books. This thing looked rather like the people of the planet Smeag, who had tried to wall up Captain McGee in a glass pyramid so he would roast to death when the purple sun rose above the horizon. But also it looked rather like Mr. Schneider, who mowed the lawns on Faculty Row, and it grinned at Tommy. "Hello," he said in a clear treble, which shook uncontrollably with his excitement. "I'm Tommy Driscoll of Earth. We're friendly if you're friendly. We're tough if you're tough. How about it?" That was an exact quotation from the comic book in which Captain McGee had made contact with the people of the system of the 20 Suns, and later had to fight against swarms of spaceships which wanted to capture his star maps so they could find Earth and attack it treacherously without warning. The thing answered Tommy. It didn't use words, of course, but in the comic books, mind-to-mind communication of alien peoples is common enough. Captain McGee had done it more than once, and the Star Rover frequently, wondering more widely than McGee as he did. Tommy knew what the thing was saying, and his piping small boy voice answered in his father's laboratory, and he knew that the thing understood him too. The comic books were specifically coming true. The thing spoke respectfully and cordially, though of course it did not really speak at all. Its people wanted to be friends with Earth, of course. They had been watching Earth with radar for centuries, so it told Tommy jovially. They knew that sooner or later Earthmen would roam the stars and benevolently rule all the planets of all the suns of the galaxy in which Earth is placed, because, of course, Earth has uranium and other heavy metals supplying atomic energy, while other planets are not so fortunate. Tommy's eyes glowed, but he was extraordinarily composed in the heroic calm of children in exciting make-believe. "Oh, sure," said Tommy largely to the thing of outer space. "We're going to have a space patrol that will make all the people on all the planets behave. I'm going to be a captain in it. Maybe we'll come and visit you first of all. How far away are you?" The thing could not tell Tommy in mind-to-mind converse. The thought it had could not be translated into words by Tommy Driscoll's brain, but the distance was very great, and it explained quickly they were able to talk over so vast a chasm as if to face, because of... Again, Tommy's brain was not able to translate the mental impressions he received. He could recognize the meanings the thing wanted to convey if the meanings were stored away in his memory, but naturally, complex technical concepts were simply not in his vocabulary. The thing seemed satisfied to fail. "Have you got spaceships and ray guns and gravity nullifiers and mysterious rays?" asked Tommy eagerly. "Our scientists haven't even made ray guns yet." The thing said that of course its race had such things. It added encouragingly that men would have them soon, of course. With heavy elements, even copper and iron, it would be easy. Then an overtone came into the thoughts that crowded into Tommy's brain from somewhere beyond the stars. Tommy did not notice the overtone at first. It was a feeling of eagerness and triumph and of a sneering superiority. Tommy got just a momentary impression of its thought of a space patrol subjugating all the galaxy to Earth, and the barest instantaneous flash of hatred because of that thought. But he was too much excited to notice. He was absorbed in his question about ray guns. It said that they were simple. In fact, he would tell him how to make one, and it began simply to explain. A bit of copper wire, twisted just so, and a bit of carbon and a morsel of iron. It urged Tommy to make one immediately. It would guide his hands. The adjustment of the iron and carbon was delicate. Tommy was a small boy, and he sturdily controlled his own hands. In the end, the thing simply told him what to do. He made the contrivance it suggested, putting the wire and iron and carbon together on a bit of board, having salvaged them from his father's supplies. The result did not look too impressive, to be sure. It did not even look like a ray pistol, and that may account for what ultimately happened. Because when it was finished, and Tommy regarded it with a faint and illogical disappointment because it didn't look like Captain McGee's ray pistol, he suddenly felt the eager triumph in the thing which had instructed him. He glanced at the screen, and the thing was looking out of it with a ravening, unguarded hatred in its expression. To Tommy it abruptly looked like the leader of those Mercurians who had wanted to wipe out the human race so they could emigrate to Earth. And suddenly he realized that it hated him and all of humanity with a terrible, burning fury. "Say," said Tommy Driscoll, his small boy's hands clenching and his brows contracting in the best possible imitation of Space Captain McGee. "This don't look so good." His voice wobbled suddenly, and he swallowed. "I'm going to ask my father about this." The thing argued, plausibly, flatteringly, but Tommy felt corrosive hatred behind the ingratiating thoughts. Somehow it reminded him of the dictator of Pluto in one of the comic books he had read only the day before. It asked almost sneeringly if he was afraid. "Scared, no," said Tommy in his clear treble, but with the pretentious grimness of McGee. "I'm just cagey. I'll have my father look this over to see if it's what you say it is." Then the thing raged. Into Tommy's brain there came such menaces, such threats, that his mind reeled. There was authority there too, and at 10 years one is accustomed to obey authority. But there was sudden deep suspicion in Tommy's mind too, and he was fortified by all his knowledge of how the Star Rover and Captain McGee behaved when defying worm monsters and giraffe men and immaterial entities and other non-human races. As the thing raged at him, trying to overwhelm his will with iterated and reiterated commands and threats and sneers and mockery and derision and everything else which should have made Tommy try out his gadget, as the thing raged at him, Tommy fought sturdily, but under a strain which manifested itself as terror, and then panic, and then as hysterical defiance. Which, of course, was essential if the comic books were ordained by fate and destiny to come true. Tommy was white and shaking and terrified when he got home. His family was at breakfast. He went into the dining room on leaden feet and with a whipped, scared look on his chalky white face. It was 9 o'clock. Tommy had slipped away at sunrise. Now he returned, carrying a seemingly crude and seemingly purposeless object in his hand. It was made of copper wire with a bit of carbon and a morsel of iron. "Where have you been?" demanded his father sternly. He didn't call Tommy Captain, which means that Tommy was in disgrace. Tommy looked at his father numbly, who shook all over. "I said, where have you been?" His father repeated. "Your mother and I have been worried." Tommy swallowed. Then suddenly he went all to pieces. He burst into raging tears and flung the contrivance the thing had described into the midst of the breakfast table dishes. "That old thing," he sobbed in hysterical fury. "It was in the television screen, and it told me how to make this ray gun, and it told me to turn it on, and I was going to when I remembered that octopus scientist from Centauri who left a note for Captain McGee to make something, and signed it Doc Blandy, and if he'd made it, it would have blown up the whole Earth." His father and mother stared. To have one's small son arrive at the breakfast table in a state of frenzy is upsetting. It is worse when he flings odd objects on the table and shatters a flower vase, while sobbing of impossibilities. What's this?" asked his father, at once startled and uneasy. "What are you talking about, son?" Tommy beat on the table with his fists. He blubbered, but he babbled with the starkly precise articulation of hysteria. His face was utterly white. He was beside himself. I tuned in the set in the laboratory," he cried, in little sobbing bursts of speech. I unscrambled it, and the thing looked at me. It was a thing that hated humans. It told me how to make this, and... Tommy's father went pale himself. He got quickly, and his chair fell over backward. He tried to touch Tommy comfortingly, but Tommy thrust him away. "Too many comic books," said Tommy's father, frightened. "I'll get him to the doctor." I guessed what it wanted," panted Tommy, sobbing. "And it knew that I was thinking, and it got mad. I knew it got mad. It laughed at me and asked me if I was a coward and scared to try the thing I'd made. And I said, 'You old Mercurian, you old Plutonian, you want to blow up Earth.' And I went bang. I smashed that television screen, and I smashed..." Then Tommy buried his head in his mother's lap and howled, and his father and mother looked at each other, white-faced, because they thought his mind had cracked. Even temporarily, it was awful to think about. But then Professor Wardle, breakfasting with them, said very softly, "Great heavens!" He was looking at the contrivance Tommy had made under the thing's instruction. It wasn't quite like anything that anybody on Earth had ever made before, but a scientist looking at it would see more than Tommy could have imagined. Professor Wardle saw aspects that made sense. Then he saw things that he could understand but could not possibly have devised. Then he saw the implications. Look, said Professor Wardle, dry-throated. "It's true. Look what he made. What this thing would do." With shaking hands, he disconnected a wire so it could not possibly be turned on by accident. Then he trembled. Tommy wept himself back to something like composure in his mother's arms. The antics of his father and Professor Wardle helped, of course. They babbled at each other over his contrivance. They looked incredulously at each other. Then they drew diagrams at each other, talking feverishly. Then Tommy's father remembered him. "Captain," said Tommy's father, and there was sweat on his face, "you did a good day's work all right, but please don't do it again without warning me. This contrivance of yours isn't a ray pistol. It's a thing that will start a chain reaction in carbon and iron. If you'd turned it on, all the carbon and iron within its range would have started to act like an atomic pile, and it would have spread, and we couldn't have stopped it. There wouldn't have been any more Earth." Tommy blinked at him, catching his breath from time to time as a small boy will do after desperate weeping. Then his eyes began to shine. "Gee," said Tommy, that thing was trying to destroy Earth, wasn't he? And I stopped him." "He was," said Tommy's father in a very queer voice indeed. "And you did. If a grown-up had been in your place, the trick would have been different, and it probably would have worked." Tommy ceased to catch his breath. He glowed. "I was like Captain McGee," he said breathlessly. Tommy's father swallowed. He needed to hold tightly to his self-control. He, like Professor Wardle, had all the sensations now of a man who had just realized that his life, and that of his family, and that of every other human being on Earth, had hung by a hair for seconds. But he saw too that the deadly small contrivance which had not annihilated humanity made use of and so revealed exactly the new principles Earth scientists needed most urgently to know. It would mean atomic engines and power and spaceships and ray guns. They would mean a space patrol to protect Earth against just such creatures that had been foiled by Tommy Driscoll. And that meant— "Yes," said Tommy's father gently, "just like Captain McGee, Tommy. It appears that the comic books are coming true."
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story.
Restricted Tool by Malcolm B. Morehart, Jr. Originally published in Imagination Stories of Science and Fantasy, January 1953. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Richard Clark loaded his shotgun. He glanced up the canyon, grey and misty under cold dawn sky. A cottontail darted from a nearby bush and bounced away. Clark's gun sights followed in a weaving line after his bobbing target. Before he could draw a bead, the rabbit vanished behind a distant scrub oak. Clark stalked him quietly. He knew he'd bag this one without trouble, but any others around him would take cover as his first shot. His boots crunched loudly on gravel. At the sound, the rabbit sprang into the open and zigzagged toward a thicket. Furious at his clumsiness, Clark blasted away with both barrels. He charged up the canyon, fumbling in his parka for more shells, and crashed through dank high brush into a shadowy clearing. The soft rustling sound quickly faded. "Well, there he goes," Clark grumbled. Something metallic glittered in a low thorny shrub, and he bent down, curious. From a black cord caught in its branches dangled a silvery pocket flashlight. He smiled faintly as he pulled it loose. After months of testing and inspecting complicated electronic devices, he found simple gadgets amusing. He pressed a button on one end and eyed a white knob on the other. When it didn't light up, he stuffed it in a pocket, finished reloading, and sighed, "At least I bagged something." "Quite true," a voice shrilled behind him. Clark whirled around and gasped in astonishment. Two squat, dwarvish men crouched at the far side of the clearing. When he swung up his 16 gauge, two lights flashed, and it slid out of his hand. He buckled dizzily with weakness and nausea, but then an invisible force jolted him upright and motionless. He felt rigid as stone. "Who are you?" Clark called out hoarsely. They approached, jabbering in a strange tongue. Bluish dawnlight seemed to tint their scrawny bare arms and legs a deeper, ghastly blue. From weasel-shaped heads bulged enormous dark eyes which stared at him unblinkingly. As they waddled closer, they puffed under the weight of heavy belts sagging with rows of odd translucent instruments. One creature wore earphones. The other, his bald head sunken between his shoulders, opened a round, moist, pink-rimmed mouth and bowed stiffly. "Forgive us, please," he piped. "My biologist friend has broken regulations." "Who are you?" Clark choked again. The bald one's eyes closed and his belly quivered with high, tremulous laughter. "Tell him, Ursie." "Don't blame me," the other called. Ursie squeaked, then pointed a claw-like finger at a glowing disc in his belt. "Interference disturbed the scannerscope. I didn't see him until he fired." Baldy chuckled. "He was after food, not your ugly hide. But in your unseemly haste to escape, you dropped a valuable tool. A very careless blunder. And now instead of mold specimens, you collected a human. I knew this expedition would prove interesting." "We have to dispose of him," Ursie shrieked and waved a black tube at Clark menacingly. "You'd kill him to recover your tool?" Baldy's nose twitched. "Remember, we prepare separate reports for the council. Don't expect me to aid in breaking the law." Ursie was painfully silent. Baldy seemed to relish his companion's distress. You realize, Ursi, you're responsible for this illegal contact. Also, may I remind you that the law reads in part, on pain of death, no human shall be molested, coerced, or in any way injured by an expeditionary member's overt action. Can't we bargain with him? Ursi asked irritably. Why, of course. Offer him our ship or your life, Baldy said. Ursi scowled. If we take the tool and induce amnesia, the law clearly prohibits that. Let him keep it then, Ursi said angrily, rubbing a pointed blue chin. I'll destroy its power principle first. Baldy sighed. I repeat, this isn't a brainless Martian without legal rights. You abandoned it. A human found it. By merely picking up the tool, he establishes a salvage claim. You call that law? Ursi raged. Stupid technicalities that settle one problem to raise a worse one. Until the Council ratifies the amendment foreseeing this contingency, Baldy explained, you must abide by the original code. But the tool's restricted. Restricted for 30 solar years according to the probability graphs, mused Baldy. You should have thought of that. Ursi's wide, glittering eyes terrified Clark. But after an agonizing silence, he heard Ursi whine fearfully. We can't allow this. Can't you read his basic attitudes? He's suffering from the Corb power complex. Baldy shrugged. Your misfortune, my dear Ursi. Ursi edged warily toward Clark as if he were a ferocious but chained beast. Your nation is a member of the Western Alliance? Bewildered, Clark cleared his throat. Yes. You have atomic weapons you intend using against your enemy, against the Eastern Empire? If they attack us, Clark muttered nervously. Ursi shot an accusing look at Baldy, who frowned. They're vicious little children, Ursi ranted. The decision placing the tool on the restricted list is perfectly justified. We made no effort to hinder their atomic researches, but in the case of this tool, they have the ingenuity to combine it with atomic bombs. If he returns with it, he'll wreck 1,000 years of human culture. Ursi's excited words puzzled Clark, who was overcoming his early shock. But the cylinder in his pocket was still more baffling. What was it? What terrible power did it control? Spare your world suffering, Ursi warned. Surrender it to me. Clark considered. Sheltered by their law, he knew he could make a free decision. The thing was powerful, but they claimed it was exceedingly dangerous, and they seemed wiser, far wiser than men. The mysterious force still binding him and the hints of restrictions on human progress convinced him of that. Still, possession was 9/10 of any law. He calculated nervously. Well, Ursi shrilled, your hands are now free to move. Obediently Clark groped in his pocket. When his fingertips touched the cool metal, the thrill of possessing immense power overwhelmed him. He sputtered, It's mine. I won't misuse it. Baldy convulsed with laughter. Ursi jabbered fiercely, but Baldy raised a thin claw. He spoke softly, and Ursi's eyes brightened. Ursi nodded, but whatever he had agreed to still left him looking doubtful and uncertain. Baldy smiled warmly. Keep it, he said, and keep your promise. Ursi doesn't trust you, but I do. I know you won't abuse this power. Clark felt his body freeze rigid as a statue again. They pushed their way out of the clearing and disappeared. Overhead a bird chirped in loneliness, and the sky slowly turned pearly-hued as the paralysis left him. Flexing his muscles, he shook his head. The creepy little men were all part of a crazy hallucination. His mad rabbit hunt and the deafening roar of his gunfire had temporarily unhinged his mind. A low humming sound interrupted his moody pondering. Suddenly he reeled as the ground shuddered beneath him, and he staggered blindly in pitch darkness. He opened his eyes to look around, dazed. His shotgun was missing, but the shiny cylinder was clutched tightly in his hand. Clark trembled as he examined it. Along its length were etched a row of queer symbols, probably directions for its operation or servicing, he decided. He aimed the knob at some rocks a few yards away and pressed the button. but they didn't explode or disintegrate under a lethal ray. Then, discovering that a narrow center section of the cylinder revolved by slow, even degrees, he tried again impatiently. A loud clatter made him look up, gaping. A cluster of rocks hung motionless in the air. When his finger lifted, they fell to earth. The mechanism neutralized gravitational pull. Objects could float. Breathing excitedly, Clark twisted the center section further. The stones shot up into the sky and disappeared. Quickly he adjusted the mechanism's control and brought them flashing back. He stared at the cylinder in unbelieving awe. Power men dreamed of surged inside it like an eager magic genie. He experimented carefully, floating the rocks at different angles and then hurtling them skywards. When he cut off the strange power, they crashed heavily to the ground. The possibilities were tremendous, and aside from the natural hazards of collision, how could it imperil mankind? Then, as a thin cloud of dust billowed up from the fallen rocks, a vision of its war potential burst upon him. Clumsy, costly rockets with a single payload were obsolete. Atomic bombs could be showered almost instantly on an enemy. "I know you won't abuse this power." Clark recalled Baldy's hopeful, trusting words and grinned. No, he wouldn't abuse it. He realized the aliens had not understated its deadliness. No matter how the military pressed him, he wouldn't permit its use for mass bombings in the coming war. Not unless the enemy really threatened to overrun the world. He left the clearing and headed down the canyon. When Clark reached the mouth of the canyon, he frowned. Out on a green meadow, a farmer drove a tractor, busily ploughing deep furrows for a new crop. A trim ranch house in the distance gleamed in the morning sunlight. Funny. Earlier, when he had crossed the field, he hadn't noticed a sign of civilization, but it had been nearly dark then. He strolled casually down to a rude stone wall and watched the tractor churn toward him. The farmer waved. He jolted to a halt, cut the engine, and wiped a red bandana over his wrinkled, sweating face. Clark glanced down at his own shabby clothes and rubbed a rough, bristly chin. If he looked like a bum, his brief demonstration would seem all the more amazing. "Pretty hot work, eh?" Clark greeted him. "Yep," the old farmer nodded as he drank from a canteen. Clark grinned. History would record this man as the first person to actually witness a degravitator at work. Clark studied the unploughed side of the meadow, then pointed at a large half-buried boulder. "You have a little work there, mister. I think a Clark farm helper will do the trick." The farmer gave him a puzzled look. Clark calmly beamed the rock. At first it strained up and down, but finally wrenched free. He floated it up in a slow arc, then deliberately dropped it with a heavy thud. Clark chuckled as the farmer tried to hide his astonishment with a poker face. "That for sale?" he asked shrewdly. Clark laughed heartily. "Not this one. I'll make a fortune manufacturing these little babies." "How'd you figure that?" Clark frowned at the farmer's indifference. "Can't you see its possibilities? I just showed you." "That's no good for farm work," the farmer said, reaching under his tractor seat. He raised what resembled a snub-nosed automatic. "This is a real beauty. Had this general-purpose degrav for 2 years and no trouble yet." He squeezed the trigger, and the boulder skimmed across the field. "That looks like an old Harley single-drive you got there," the farmer said. "What'd you do? Recondition it and pep up the atomic pile?" Stunned, Clark swallowed hard. The old farmer leaned over his wheel in curiosity. "Those old-timers are pretty scarce. I remember when the first model came out about 20 years ago, just after the war ended." "After the war?" Clark stammered. His mind spun in dizzy, sickening whirls. Degravitators were commonplace farm tools. Where was he? Then suddenly he knew the meaning of his strange blackout and Baldy's sly whirls. I know you won't abuse this power." How could he? Their super science had catapulted him past the war years into the future. The old farmer said gently, "Tell you what, son, the wife's been nagging me for a pocket digrav to move furniture around the house. I'll give you $5 for it and a square meal. You look kind of pale."
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Tony and the Beetles by Philip K. Dick. Originally published in Orbit, Volume 1, Number 2, 1953. Narrated by Tom Trussel. A 10-year-old boy grows up fast when history catches up with the human race. Reddish-yellow sunlight filtered through the thick quartz windows into the sleep compartment. Tony Rossi yawned, stirred a little, then opened his black eyes and sat up quickly. With one motion he tossed the covers back and slid to the warm metal floor. He clicked off his alarm clock and hurried to the closet. It looked like a nice day. The landscape outside was motionless, undisturbed by winds or dust shift. The boy's heart pounded excitedly. He pulled his trousers on, zipped up the reinforced mesh, struggled into his heavy canvas shirt, then sat down on the edge of the cot to tug on his boots. He closed the seams around their tops, and then did the same with his gloves. Next he adjusted the pressure on his pump unit and strapped it between his shoulder blades. He grabbed his helmet from the dresser, and he was ready for the day. In the dining compartment, his mother and father had finished breakfast. Their voices drifted to him as he clattered down the ramp. A disturbed murmur. He paused to listen. What were they talking about? Had he done something wrong again? And then he caught it. Behind their voices was another voice, static and crackling pops. The all-system audio signal from Rigel 4. They had it turned up full blast. The dull thunder of the monitor's voice boomed loudly. The war. Always the war. He sighed and stepped out into the dining compartment. "Morning," his father muttered. "Good morning, dear," his mother said absently. She sat with her head turned to one side, wrinkles of concentration webbing her forehead. Her thin lips were drawn together in a tight line of concern. His father had pushed his dirty dishes back and was smoking, elbows on the table, dark hairy arms bare and muscular. He was scowling, intent on the jumble roar from the speaker above the sink. "How's it going?" Tony asked. He slid into his chair and reached automatically for the ersatz grapefruit. "Any news from Orion?" Neither of them answered. They didn't hear him. He began to eat his grapefruit. Outside, beyond the little metal and plastic housing unit, sounds of activity grew. Shouts and muffled crashes as rural merchants and their trucks rumbled along the highway toward Carnot. The reddish daylight swelled. Beetlejuice was rising quietly and majestically. "Nice day," Tony said. "No flux wind. I think I'll go down to the N Quarter a while. We're building a neat spaceport, a model of course, but we've been able to get enough materials to lay out strips for—" With a savage snarl, his father reached out and struck. The audio roar immediately died. "I knew it!" He got up and moved angrily away from the table. "I told them it would happen. They shouldn't have moved so soon. Should have built up Class A supply bases first." "Isn't our main fleet moving in from Bellatrix?" Tony's mother fluttered anxiously. "According to last night's summary, the worst that can happen is Orion 9 and 10 will be dumped." Joseph Rossi laughed harshly. "The hell with last night's summary. They know as well as I do what's happening." "What's happening?" Tony echoed as he pushed aside his grapefruit and began to ladle out dry cereal. "Are we losing the battle?" "Yes!" His father's lips twisted. "Earthmen, losing to Beetles. I told them, but they couldn't wait. My God, there's 10 good years left in this system. Why'd they have to push on? Everybody knew Orion would be tough. The whole damn Beetle fleet's strung out around there, waiting for us, and we have to barge right in." "But nobody ever thought Beetles would fight," Leah Rossi protested mildly. "Everybody thought they'd just fire a few blasts and then—" "They have to fight. Orion's the last jump-off. If they don't fight here, where the hell can they fight? Rossi swore savagely. Of course they're fighting. We have all their planets except the inner Orion string. Not that they're worth much, but it's a principle of the thing. If we built up strong supply bases, we'd have broken up the Beetle fleet and really clobbered it.
Don't say beetle, Tony murmured as he finished his cereal. They're Pasudeti, same as here. The word beetle comes from Beetlejuice, an Arabian word we invented ourselves.
Joe Rossi's mouth opened and closed. What are you, a goddamn beetle lover?
Joe, Elias snapped, for heaven's sake.
Rossi moved toward the door. If I was 10 years younger, I'd be out there. I'd really show those shiny-shelled insects what the hell they're up against. Them and their junky beat-up old hulks. Converted frighters! His eyes blazed. When I think of them shooting down Terran cruisers with our boys in them.
Orion's their system, Tony murmured.
Their system? When the hell did you get to be an authority on space law? Why, I ought to... He broke off, choked with rage. My own kid, he muttered. One more crack out of you today and I'll hang one on you you'll feel the rest of the week.
Tony pushed his chair back. I won't be around here today. I'm going to Carnet with my EEP.
Yeah, to play with Beetles.
Tony said nothing. He was already sliding his helmet in place and snapping the clamps tight. As he pushed through the back door into the lock membrane, he unscrewed his oxygen tap and set the tank filter into action. An automatic response conditioned by a lifetime spent on a colony planet in an alien system. A faint flux wind caught at him and swept yellow-red dust around his boots. Sunlight glittered from the metal roof of his family's housing unit, one of endless rows of squat boxes set in the sandy slope, protected by the line of ore refining installations against the horizon. He made an impatient signal, and from the storer's shed his EEP came gliding out, catching the sunlight on its chrome trim. "We're going down into Carnet," Tony said, unconsciously slipping into the past dialect. "Hurry up." The EEP took up its position behind him, and he started briskly down the slope, over the shifting sand toward the road. There were quite a few traders out today. It was a good day for the market. Only a fourth of the year was fit for travel. Beetlejuice was an erratic and undependable son, not at all like Sol. According to the edutapes, fed to Tony 4 hours a day, 6 days a week, he had never seen Sol himself. He reached the noisy road. Pasudeti were everywhere, whole groups of them, with their primitive combustion-driven trucks, battered and filthy, motors grinding protestingly. He waved at the trucks as they pushed past him. After a moment, one slowed down. It was piled with tis, bundled heaps of grey vegetables dried and prepared for the table, a staple of the Pasudeti diet. Behind the wheel lounged a dark-faced elderly Pas, one arm over the open window, a rolled leaf between his lips. He was like all other Pasudeti, lank and hard-shelled, encased in a brittle sheath in which he lived and died. "You want a ride?" the Pas murmured, required protocol when an Earthman on foot was encountered. "Is there room for my EEP?" The Pas made a careless motion with his claw. "It can run behind." Sardonic amusement touched his ugly old face. "If it gets to Carnet, we'll sell it for scrap. We can use a few condensers and relay tubing. We're short on electronic maintenance stuff." "I know," Tony said solemnly as he climbed into the cabin of the truck. "It's all been sent to the big repair base at Orion 1 for your war fleet." Amusement vanished from the leathery face. "Yes, the war fleet." He turned away and started up the truck again. In the back, Tony's EEP had scrambled up on the load of tis and was gripping precariously with his magnetic lines. Tony noticed the Pasudeti's sudden change of expression and was puzzled. He started to speak to him, but now he noticed unusual quietness among the other Pas, in the other trucks behind and in front of his own. The war, of course. It had swept through this system a century ago. These people had been left behind. Now all eyes were on Orion, on the battle between the Terran warfleet and the Pasudeti collection of armed freighters. "Is it true," Tony asked carefully, "that you're winning?"
The elderly Pass grunted. "We hear rumours." Tony considered. "My father says Terra went ahead too fast. He said we should have consolidated. We didn't assemble adequate supply bases. He used to be an officer when he was younger. He was with the fleet for 2 years. The Pass was silent a moment. "It's true," he said at last, "that when you're so far from home, supply is a great problem. We, on the other hand, don't have that. We have no distances to cover." "Do you know anybody fighting?" "I have distant relatives." The answer was vague. The Pass obviously didn't want to talk about it. "Have you ever seen your war fleet?" "Not as it exists now. When this system was defeated, most of our units were wiped out. Remnants limped on to Orion and joined the Orion fleet." "Your relatives were with the remnants?" "That's right." "Then you were alive when this planet was taken?" "Why do you ask?" The old Pass quivered violently. "What business is it of yours?" Tony leaned out and watched the walls and buildings of Carnet grow ahead of them. Carnet was an old city. It had stood thousands of years. The Parsudeti civilization was stable. It had reached a certain point of technocratic development and then leveled off. The Pass had inter-system ships that had carried people and freight between planets in the days before the Terran Confederation. They had combustion-driven cars, audiophones, a power network of a magnetic type. Their plumbing was satisfactory, and the medicine was highly advanced. They had art forms, emotional and exciting. They had a vague religion. "Who do you think will win the battle?" Tony asked. "I don't know." With a sudden jerk, the old Pass brought the truck to a crashing halt. "This is as far as I go. Please get out and take your EEP with you." Tony faltered in surprise. "But aren't you going—" "No, father!" Tony pushed the door open. He was vaguely uneasy. There was a hard, fixed expression on the leathery face, and the old creature's voice had a sharp edge he had never heard before. "Thanks," he murmured. He hopped down into the red dust and signaled his EEP. It released its magnetic lines, and instantly the truck started up with a roar, passing on inside the city. Tony watched it go, still dazed. The hot dust lapped at his ankles. He automatically moved his feet and slapped at his trousers. A truck honked, and his EEP quickly moved him from the road up to the level pedestrian ramp. Parsudeti in swarms moved by, endless lines of rural people hurrying into Carnet on their daily business. A massive public bus had stopped by the gate and was letting off passengers. Male and female Pass, and children. They laughed and shouted. The sounds of their voices blended with the low hum of the city. "Going in," a sharp Parsudeti voice sounded close behind him. "Keep moving, you're blocking the ramp." It was a young female, with a heavy armload clutched in her claws. Tony felt embarrassed. Female Pass had a certain telepathic ability, part of their sexual makeup. It was effective on Earthmen at close range. "Here," she said. "Give me a hand." Tony nodded his head, and the EEP accepted the female's heavy armload. "I'm visiting the city," Tony said as they moved with the crowd towards the gate. "I got a ride most of the way, but the driver let me off out here." "You're from the settlement?" "Yes." She eyed him critically. "You've always lived here, haven't you?" "I was born here. My family came here from Earth 4 years before I was born. My father was an officer in the fleet. He earned an emigration priority." "So you've never seen your own planet. How old are you?" 10 years, Terran." "You shouldn't have asked the driver so many questions." They passed through the decontamination shield and into the city. An information square loomed ahead. Pass men and women were packed around it. Moving chutes and transport cars rumbled everywhere. Buildings and ramps and open-air machinery, the city was sealed in a protective, dust-proof envelope. Tony unfastened his helmet and clipped it to his belt. The air was stale-smelling, artificial, but usable. "Let me tell you something," the young female said carefully as she strode along the foot ramp beside Tony. "I wonder if this is a good day for you to come into Carnet. I know you've been coming here regularly to play with your friends, but perhaps today you ought to stay at home in your settlement. Why? Because today everybody is upset. I know, Tony said. My mother and father were upset. They were listening to the news from our base in the Rigel system. I don't mean your family. Other people are listening too. These people here. My race. They're upset all right, Tony admitted. But I come here all the time. There's nobody to play with at the settlement, and anyhow we're working on a project. A model spaceport. That's right. Tony was envious. I sure wish I was a telepath. It must be fun. The female Passadetti was silent. She was deep in thought. What would happen, she asked, if your family left here and returned to Earth? That couldn't happen. There's no room for us on Earth. Sea bombs destroyed most of Asia and North America back in the 20th century. Suppose you had to go back. Tony did not understand. But we can't. Habitable portions of Earth are overcrowded. Our main problem is finding places for Terrans to live in other systems, he added. And anyhow, I don't particularly want to go to Terra. I'm used to it here. All my friends are here. I'll take my packages, the female said. I go this other way, down this third-level ramp. Tony nodded to his EEP, and it lowered the bundles into the female's claws. She lingered a moment, trying to find the right words. Good luck, she said. With what? She smiled faintly, ironically. With your model spaceport. I hope you and your friends get to finish it. Of course we'll finish it, Tony said, surprised. It's almost done. What did she mean? The Passadetti woman hurried off before he could ask her. Tony was troubled and uncertain. More doubts filled him. After a moment he headed slowly into the lane that took him toward the residential section of the city, past the stores and factories to the place where his friends lived. The group of Passadetti children eyed him silently as he approached. They had been playing in the shade of an immense hengelo, whose ancient branches drooped and swayed with the air currents pumped through the city. Now they sat, unmoving. I didn't expect you today, Beprith said, in an expressionless voice. Tony halted awkwardly, and his EEP did the same. How are things? He murmured. Fine. I got a ride part way. Fine. Tony squatted down in the shade. None of the past children stirred. They were small, not as large as Terran children. Their shells had not hardened, had not turned dark and opaque like horn. It gave them a soft, unformed appearance. But at the same time it lightened their load. They moved more easily than their elders. They could hop and skip around still, but they were not skipping right now. What's the matter? Tony demanded. What's wrong with everybody? No one answered. Where's the model? He asked. Have you fellows been working on it? After a moment, Lyra nodded slightly. Tony felt dull anger rise up inside him. Say something. What's the matter? What are you all mad about? Mad? Beprith echoed. We're not mad. Tony scratched aimlessly in the dust. He knew what it was. The war again. The battle going on near Orion. His anger burst up wildly. Forget the war. Everything was fine yesterday, before the battle. Sure, Lyra said. It was fine. Tony caught the edge to his voice. It happened 100 years ago. It's not my fault. Sure, Beprith said. This is my home, isn't it? Haven't I got as much right here as anyone else? I was born here. Sure, Lyra said tonelessly. Tony appealed to them helplessly. Do you have to act this way? You didn't act this way yesterday. I was here yesterday. All of us were here yesterday. What's happened since yesterday? The battle, Beprith said. What difference does that make? Why does that change everything? There's always war. There have been battles all the time as long as I can remember. What's different about this? Beprith broke apart a clump of dirt with his strong claws. After a moment he tossed it away and got slowly to his feet. Well, he said thoughtfully. "According to our audio relay, it looks as if our fleet is going to win this time." "Yes," Tony agreed, not understanding. "My father says we didn't build up adequate supply bases. We'll probably have to fall back to—" And then the impact hit him. "You mean for the first time in 100 years?" "Yes," Lyra said, also getting up. The others got up too. They moved away from Tony towards the nearby house. "We're winning. The Terran flank was turned half an hour ago. Your right wing has folded completely." Tony was stunned. "And it matters. It matters to all of you." "Matters?" Beprith halted, suddenly blazing out in fury. "Sure it matters. For the first time in a century. The first time in our lives we're beating you. We have you on the run. You—" He choked out the word, almost spat it out. "You white grubs!" They disappeared into the house. Tony sat gazing stupidly down at the ground, his hands still moving aimlessly. He had heard the word before, seen it scrawled on walls and in the dust near the settlement. White grubs, the past term of derision for Terrans, because of their softness, their whiteness, lack of hard shells, pulpy, doughy skin. But they had never dared say it out loud before, to an Earthman's face. Beside him, his EEP stirred restlessly. Its intricate radio mechanism sensed the hostile atmosphere. Automatic relays were sliding into place, circuits were opening and closing. "It's all right," Tony murmured, getting slowly up. "Maybe we'd better go back." He moved unsteadily towards the ramp, completely shaken. The EEP walked calmly ahead, its metal face blank and confident, feeling nothing, saying nothing. Tony's thoughts were a wild turmoil. He shook his head, but the crazy spinning kept up. He couldn't make his mind slow down, lock in place. "Wait a minute," a voice said, Beprith's voice from the open doorway, cold and withdrawn, almost unfamiliar. "What do you want?" Beprith came toward him, claws behind his back in the formal Parsudetti posture, used between total strangers. "You shouldn't have come here today." "I know," Tony said. Beprith got out a bit of tis stalk and began to roll it into a tube. He pretended to concentrate on it. "Look," he said. "You said you have a right here, but you don't." Tony murmured. "Do you understand why not? You said it isn't your fault. I guess not, but it's not my fault either. Maybe it's nobody's fault. I've known you a long time." 5 years, Terran." Beprith twisted the stalk up and tossed it away. "Yesterday we played together. We worked on the spaceport, but we can't play today. My family said to tell you not to come here any more." He hesitated and did not look Tony in the face. "I was going to tell you anyhow, before they said anything." "Oh," Tony said. "Everything that's happened today, the battle, our fleet stand. We didn't know. We didn't dare hope. You see, a century of running. First this system, then the Rigel system, all the planets. Then the other Orion stars. We fought here and there, scattered fights. Those that got away joined up. We supplied the base at Orion. You people didn't know. But there was no hope. At least, nobody thought there was." He was silent a moment. "Funny," he said. "What happens when your back's to the wall and there isn't any further place to go? Then you have to fight." "If our supply bases—" Tony began thickly, but Beprith cut him off savagely. "Your supply bases? Don't you understand? We're beating you. Now you'll have to get out, all you white grubs, out of our system." Tony's EEP moved forward ominously. Beprith saw it. He bent down, snatched up the rock, and hurled it straight at the EEP. The rock clanged off the metal hull and bounced harmlessly away. Beprith snatched up another rock. Lyra and the others came quickly out of the house. An adult pass loomed up behind them. Everything was happening too fast. More rocks crashed against the EEP. One struck Tony on the arm. "Get out!" Beprith screamed. "Don't come back! This is our planet!" His claws snatched at Tony. "We'll tear you to pieces if you—" Tony smashed him in the chest. The soft shell gave like rubber, and the pass stumbled back. He wobbled and fell over, gasping and screeching. "Beetle!" Tony breathed hoarsely. Suddenly he was terrified. A crowd of Passudetti was forming rapidly. They surged on all sides, hostile faces, dark and angry, a rising thunder of rage. More stones showered. Some struck the EEP, others fell around Tony, near his boots. One whizzed past his face. Quickly he slid his helmet in place. He was scared. He knew his EEP's E-signal had already gone out, but it would be minutes before a ship could come. Besides, there were other Earthmen in the city to be taken care of. There were Earthmen all over the planet. In all the cities. On all the 23 Beetlejuice planets. On the 14 Rigel planets. On the other Orion planets. "We have to get out of here," he muttered to the EEP. "Do something!" A stone hit him on the helmet. The plastic cracked. Air leaked out, and then the autoseal filmed over. More stones were falling. The pass swarmed close, a yelling, seething mass of black-sheathed creatures. He could smell them, the acrid body odor of insects, hear their claws snap, feel their weight. The EEP threw its heat beam on. The beam shifted in a wide band toward the crowd of Passudetti. Crude hand weapons appeared. A clatter of bullets burst around Tony. They were firing at the EEP. He was dimly aware of the metal body beside him. A shuddering crash. The EEP was toppled over. The crowd poured over it. The metal hull was lost from sight. Like a demented animal, the crowd tore at the struggling EEP. A few of them smashed in its head. Others tore off struts and shiny arm sections. The EEP ceased struggling. The crowd moved away, panting and clutching jagged remains. They saw Tony. As the first line of them reached for him, the protective envelope high above them shattered. A Terran scout ship thundered down, heat beam screaming. The cloud scattered in confusion, some firing, some throwing stones, others leaping for safety. Tony picked himself up and made his way unsteadily towards the spot where the scout was landing. "I'm sorry," John Rossi said gently. He touched his son on the shoulder. "I shouldn't have let you go down there today. I should have known." Tony sat hunched over in the big plastic easy chair. He rocked back and forth, face pale with shock. The scout ship which had rescued him had immediately headed back towards Carnet. There were other Earthmen to bring out, besides this first load. The boy said nothing. His mind was blank. He still heard the roar of the crowd, felt its hate, a century of pent-up fury and resentment. The memory drove out everything else. It was all around him, even now. And the sight of the floundering EEP, the metallic ripping sound as its arms and legs were torn off and carried away. His mother dabbed at his cuts and scratches with antiseptic. Joe Rossi shakily lit a cigarette and said, "If your EEP hadn't been along, they'd have killed you. Beetles." He shuddered. "I never should have let you go down there. All this time. They might have done it any time, any day. Knifed you, cut you open with their filthy goddamn claws." Below the settlement, the reddish-yellow sunlight glinted on gun barrels. Already, dull booms echoed against the crumbling hills. The defense ring was going into action. Black shapes darted and scurried up the side of the slope. Black patches moved out from Carnet toward the Terran settlement, across the dividing line the Confederation surveyors had set up a century ago. Carnet was a bubbling pot of activity. The whole city rumbled with feverish excitement. Tony raised his head. They turned our flank." "Yeah." Joe Rossi stubbed out his cigarette. "They sure did. That was at 1 o'clock. At 2 they drove a wedge right through the center of our line, split the fleet in half, broke it up, sent it running, picked us off one by one as we fell back. Christ, they're like maniacs. now that they've got the scent, the taste of our blood. But it's getting better, Leah fluttered. Our main fleet units are beginning to appear. We'll get them, Joe muttered. It'll take a while. But by God, we'll wipe them out, every last one of them. If it takes 1,000 years, we'll follow every last ship down. We'll get them all. His voice rose in a frenzy. Beetles, goddamn insects, when I think of them trying to hurt my kid with their filthy black claws. If you were younger, you'd be in the line, Leah said. It's not your fault you're too old. The heartstrain's too great. You did your job. They can't let an older person take chances. It's not your fault. Joe clenched his fists. I feel so futile. If there was only something I could do. The fleet will take care of them, Leah said soothingly. You said so yourself. They'll hunt every one of them down, destroy them all. There's nothing to worry about. Joe sagged miserably. It's no use. Let's cut it out. Let's stop kidding ourselves. What do you mean? Face it, we're not going to win, not this time. We went too far. Our time's come. There was silence. Tony sat up a little. When did you know? I've known a long time. I found out today. I didn't understand at first. This is stolen ground. I was born here, but it's stolen ground. Yes, it's stolen. It doesn't belong to us. We're here because we're stronger, but now we're not stronger. We're being beaten. They know Terrans can be licked, like anybody else. Joe Ross's face was grey and flabby. We took their planets away from them. Now they're taking them back. It'll be a while, of course. We'll retreat slowly. It'll be another 5 centuries going back. There's a lot of systems between here and Sol. Tony shook his head, still uncomprehending. Even Lai and Beprith, all of them, waiting for their time to come, for us to lose and go away again, where we came from. Joe Rossi paced back and forth. Yeah, we'll be retreating from now on, giving ground instead of taking it. It'll be like this today, losing fights, draws, stalemates, and worse. He raised his feverish eyes toward the ceiling of the little metal housing unit, face wild with passion and misery. But by God, we'll give them a run for their money, all the way back, every inch.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. Every single day.